Microsoft's Industry Experiences team in January of this year. He brought to Microsoft a wealth of actuarial experience gained from leading teams at some of the world's most respected firms in the insurance industry, including Manulife and AIG. Fun fact, Nick's first job out of college was as a statistician and economist for the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Nick, take it away.
Okay, great. So today we're talking about artificial intelligence, and I think a lot of people kind of get scared by that. It's like, oh, these are the robots taking over. And it's between artificial intelligence and machine learning, this is really, if you come from like sort of an actuarial background, it's like, okay, this is really some numerical analysis work we've been doing for years and looking at different data points and how we process that. Oh, closer? Okay, it sounds really loud to me. Sorry. So it's really, it's not as much new as people think. It's really how do we absorb data and how do we model it, and now we can do it more efficiently. So it's not some robot that's taking over. It's really how do we do our job better. So it's really through the entire ecosystem of insurance, all lines of business. How do I absorb data and then process that? So I can put a bot to have customer relations, either something like Lemonade where it's all front end, or something like WeFox, which does it at the broker-dealer side and really just makes a junior broker-dealer an experienced one because they know all the questions to ask in what order and can identify things that are missing. So you can use AI at that point, the data ingestion directly with the customer. You can do it with IoT-type devices and really do risk mitigation, on-demand risk calculations, and then post-event claims processing, fraud detection, et cetera. So it's really how do you absorb data from all sorts of different sources, and then how does that impact insurers? So I think right now Microsoft is allowing or building out tools to help make that more accessible to the insurers and developers for every line of business. Okay, so we have a panel here with people primarily on the P&C side, and so we want to talk about how they're using AI in the work that they're doing, and their tools and how they're moving forward in the industry. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I guess I can start from an intro perspective. Good afternoon, everyone. Ted Stuckey from QB Insurance Group. QB is one of the largest global property and casualty insurance carriers. We have operations in 37 countries. We do about $15 billion a year in premium. My responsibilities at QB are over emerging tech R&D, and I also am the managing director for QB Ventures. I will clear the air that I'm an investor in RiskGenius, so I will be talking very nicely about Chris today, and that's actually going to be one of the bases for the case studies that we'll talk about as we move on.
So my name is Chris Cheatham. I am a CEO of RiskGenius and beholden to Ted Stuckey here. Actually, one side note, we met 3 years ago here.
Something like that.
Yeah, like 3 years ago at this exact conference. Scheduled a meeting. I demoed the software. We parted our ways, and I was like, "We'll see." You never know where those meetings go. And 2 years later, he follows up. So appreciate that.
Okay, that's fast for carriers. 2 years. That's the benchmark.
I walked into that joke. I did not even mean for that to happen. So we apply machine learning to insurance policies. What we realized about the industry, and I can go into the origin story and all that stuff, but no one really knows what's in their insurance policies. We know customers don't, but customers don't really need to because there's a lot of people that are making sure they do. But then as we started talking to carriers and brokers, particularly on the commercial insurance side, and the regulators as well that are trying to understand what are in the forms, we realized nobody could really find anything. And so we are using machine learning to structure data in these unstructured insurance policies and then deliver it up very quickly depending on the use case.
Hi, everybody. My name's Mike Fitzgerald. I work for a research firm called Celent, which means that I don't have to be nice to Chris, but I usually am because I really like the work that he's doing. We try and help insurance companies at the intersection of business and tech, and what that means is for something like AI is to approach it from a research-based standpoint, not from a speeds and feeds, but more from a use case and from the standpoint of this is where we see our research shows a lot of people get tripped up. So what I'll be doing is talking today about use cases that we've seen and that I've personally been involved in, but also the things to look out for. So maybe, hopefully, one or two may avoid stepping in a hole as you go forward in this area.
Sorry, it's still on? Okay, good. No, I think this is great, and I think what a lot of things that are driving AI across all lines of business is really that consumption of data. So, and then finding outliers in that data. So it's gaps in policies, understanding what's being sold and not been sold, fraud detection, et cetera. So it's really filtering everywhere. It's really how do you capture that data. So, so in your business, where are you finding those gaps that people mainly, what are they forgetting? What are they finding that they need that they don't have?
Well, it's being used in almost every area of an insurance company, and I'm hoping that in our conversation today we can also talk about how and the potential that we see for the use in regulation and by regulators. But the place I would start with that is when we say AI, what are we talking about? And a lot of times it's a variety and a combination of technologies. So for example, one insurer is moving very quickly towards physical damage claims settlement without human involvement because they have so many photos of wrecked automobiles that they're actually training a system to be able to look at and figure out this damage is X or this damage is Y. But when you think about that, some of that is AI, but some of it is actually big data management. And some of it's just the ability to be able to process all of that. So one of the holes that I mentioned that we see insurer IT areas step in when they're talking to the business is to say some of this is AI, but we also have to have capabilities in being able to manage big data sets. We also have, and many times, the capability to run some of this in the cloud. So one of the things that I would stress you to think about if you're going to be a sponsor or be involved is to try, just for everyone's communication ease, to be able to tell, okay, this piece is truly AI, but this piece is another capability we need to make sure we have, and this piece is another capability.
Yeah, and to kind of segue from that, there's AI and there's like applied AI. And I think a lot of times people jump in and start doing AI without realizing the problem that they're trying to solve. And as a result, you're probably going to fail because you're going to first build up a data set that does something with certain machine learning programs, and then you're going to go try to find a problem to solve it. That's totally the wrong way to go about it, in my opinion. Find the problem first, and then figure out if AI can help solve that, and then figure out what else do you need in order to get the full solution, because probably AI is not going to be the 100% solution. Yeah, and so there's a big difference between AI, which is what you read about with Google having systems that are being professional Go players, for example, right? Versus applied AI, where you're trying to tackle a specific business problem, and that problem is solved best by machine learning or AI.
So when we're looking both from a venture investing perspective as well as a commercial relationship with startups or vendors or anyone else, we talk a lot about vertical AI, and that's really the notion that the end product is more than just the AI model. And so I actually think it's a tripping point that we've had in the industry for a while, particularly with pricing models, wherein you have these brilliant actuaries or data scientists that are building all these disparate pricing models. They're building them largely in Excel or SAS or something like that, but they're just on their own. Very rarely do you see them finally integrated into a full sort of start to finish workflow. And so because of that, you lose a lot of the value. You lose a lot of the benefits because you need high-priced, low-volume numbers of people sort of interacting with those models to maintain them and grow them and stuff over time. And then you need a bunch of integrations with legacy systems. One of the things that we look for is, for example, with RiskGenius, this full vertical, the full stack of AI. So not only is it an AI model, but it's also the UI, it's also the data layer, it's also the integration layer. It's everything soups to nuts. So our underwriters, our product professionals, they can interact with RiskGenius the same way that our data scientists could, in the same way that our back-end engineers could, because AI on its own is just a very complicated mathematical model that requires a high level of skill and sophistication to sort of interact with, and on its own, there's zero value to carriers. You can do a lot of really, really cool things with AI, but they mean nothing. Where AI really drives value is how do you get it to the point of decision making, and typically the point of decision making is not with a bunch of IT engineers and actuaries sitting around a table. It's underwriters, it's salespeople, it's claim professionals, it's product development. And so when we're looking at that, whether RiskGenius on the product development side, we have a couple other portfolio companies that are doing this on the pricing side, the AI should be secondary. The people really shouldn't care that AI is what was driving that insights, what was driving that rate. Instead, they should care about how it impacts their workflow and how it makes their lives easier. And so very rarely internally do we actually talk about AI because it's a bit of a buzzword. It's really hard to explain to people who don't honestly care. And that's not the point. The point is we're making your life better. The point is we're making it easier for you to make better decisions. And I think it's the full stack, not just the AI layer, but everything else that goes into really effectively deploying it. And that's, going back to, from like a product perspective, like a RiskGenius would do that because you've made a very deliberate choice to not put AI in people's face. In fact, you try to make it as user-friendly as possible, and very rarely do you actually talk about it other than like sales presentations. So is that a deliberate decision, or is that, how have people reacted to that?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. So when I used to sell RiskGenius, probably like 2 years ago, I would try to explain machine learning at the very beginning of the presentation and AI, and I would lose people. And so I just stopped doing that, and I started leading with, here's the problem, here's the solution. Oh, by the way, you might have done some research and saw we do machine learning. Here's what it's doing to your documents, right? So I'm not going to explain the math calculations, which frankly, I don't know them or understand them anyways, but here's what it's actually doing to the data. Then I show that to people in the software, and they're like, great, that's all I want to know. I don't want to know anything else. Thank you very much. And the other thing that your comment made me think about was like, we've spent way more resources on our user interface than we have on our AI. Just now, our AI is starting to catch up to our user interface, but like we did 500 demos. Those were not demos to improve our AI. Those were demos to understand the problem we were trying to solve better and then tweak the software that the users had actually seen. So we spent way more of our resources actually on the user interface.
So let me try and bring this home with an example. In 2007, I worked for a major commercial lines carrier, which you would all recognize the name of, which I can't mention because I'm going to tell you that we knew that we had a problem with what we came to call underwriting leakage. Now, I'm from PNC, and many of you in the room may be familiar with claims leakage, which is where a claim is settled for usually more than it should have been. But as we looked at our product development process, and we were going under a transformation project to do that, this idea of, in underwriting, we have so many forms, and we have so many contracts, and we look at the variability between two clauses that should mean the same thing. But they don't, because they were never coordinated together. They were never reviewed. These products were built independently, and we've never gone back to see. So of course, if you're going to settle a claim based on different wording with different meanings, even if you have the same intent, and to really drive this home, it's like the force majeure clause, the act of war, the act of God, the act of government is excluded. Why does a company have more than one clause that says that? Well, we did. We had multiple. We had dozens of clauses across our product portfolio. Sometimes that made a difference, sometimes it didn't. So we then said, you know what, this is a $30 million problem minimum every year, and we've been living with it. So let's get people together and let's review it, and let's go through the usual clauses and let's tidy that up. But guess what? It was 2007. We had virtually no tools other than the ubiquitous Excel spreadsheet, right, and the Word documents. But the other thing, too, is we didn't have enough lawyers. I know you didn't think you'd hear that this afternoon. Let that sink in a minute. We also didn't have enough underwriters. And even if we did, we never could have gotten the ability to pull them away and look at all these clauses and basically tighten it up. And so that's an example of AI that is, if we had had it, we would have clearly been able to, run some tests and show the value and move forward. So kind of when Ted was talking about that full stack, also when Chris was talking about start with the problem, that's one that's always stepped out to me, and I've just wished, as usual in my life, the timing was a little off, so the project died, even though we had huge justification for it, because we just couldn't pull it off.
So at QB, our implementation of RiskGenius, just in North America alone, is 150,000 policy documents. We have 10 lawyers whose full-time job is product development. Development being the key word, not proofreading, not going back through and looking at everything we've written. I think in the proof of concept, which, correct me, 8,000 documents or something like that, we had well over 100 different cyber exclusions. Cyber's pretty sexy right now. It's definitely something that you're trying to be more competitive about in the marketplace. With over 100 different exclusions that ran the gamut from everything, from completely open to completely closed, we were not only exposing ourselves, but also impacting our competitiveness in the marketplace, adding a ton of overhead from just a form maintenance perspective, and hindering our ability to sort of have a consistent approach on how we move on these new and emerging risk types. We didn't realize how many forms were being issued against these various clauses, and from an enterprise risk management perspective, we couldn't actually say what is our exposure to X, because we have so many different types, and I know very few carriers who actually do analytics on the words that they write. They care much more about the numbers, but the words are everything, being a glorified paper company. And so from an AI perspective, yeah, it's the easiest way to do it. It's the best way to do it. I don't have to have all these high-priced lawyers doing it. But from an actual ROI perspective, not only are we cutting out, what's the number of hours that you're quoting?
I believe it's 750 hours per employee.
750 hours per lawyer of efficiency that we're getting from using the RiskGenius platform in North America. That may be a bit of an understatement. And when you take that across 37 countries, that's a meaningful number. Not only is it a meaningful number from an efficiency play, but from an underwriting leakage play, it could be everything, but it's not something we look at today.
Yeah, and it can also, sort of following up on that, so so I'm coming at this from a life side. Most of my career has been on the life side, and then when my teams ran the experience analytics and a major employer insurer as well. So it's the amount of data that comes in about claims and outliers, and was always looking backwards. What could we have known? What should we have known? And now with AI and absorbing the ability to absorb all that information ahead of time, you can really analyze all that information and make better decisions from the beginning, and then also use that same set of tools after an event, a claim, et cetera, and then see if, okay, what I thought when I built my model, what actually happened, did it make sense, and go, so you can generate your experience studies, mortality and lapse rates as well, based, improved with an additional AI information. So it's that processing end to end, and then also look at the way the claims are actually paid out too.
So I know that the sort of theme of this is around ROI from AI. You're selling an AI product every day. I'm a carrier. I know how hard it is for us to calculate ROI on tech investments. What have you seen? Have you seen strategies of companies approaching the sort of ROI question differently or uniquely, or ways that stand out? Because I know there are a bunch that do it really bad, including us.
Yeah, so the AI and ROI question, it's really tricky because essentially what you're doing is you're comparing apples to oranges, right? And to give you an example, it makes people even uncomfortable to do these ROI studies, the people that are doing this work every day. So there was one woman in London, and I said to her, how do you find a document right now in your repository? And she said, oh, we have that figured out. I type in what I need, like into an email, and I send it off to our outsourced team, And then they work on it overnight, and then they'll send the document back to me the next day. So that's only 3 people, is what she said. And I was like, okay. And so I pulled up and I was like, what search did you have them run last? And so she gave it and just input it into our search engine, which is just like Google, and it pulls up the document. And there's just this quiet, right? And it's awkward because this AI can do what we all think we figured out how to do very fast, but we're doing it ridiculously slowly, really slow. With manual processes, right? So what we're talking about is basically doing manual processes with machines that can do this like instantly, literally instantly. And it's uncomfortable. These ROI studies are uncomfortable. I remember when you sent me that number of we're gonna save employees 750 hours that are using the software. I was like, huh, that's a lot. What are they gonna do? You know, and you know, I will always argue that they are now going to do higher value work. There's a lot of work that I consider to be really stupid work that's being done in insurance. Copying a clause and pasting it into a spreadsheet, and then copying another clause and pasting into a spreadsheet, and then having 10 employees doing that over 10 months, which might have been what your employer was doing, is not productive. It is, but it isn't. It's productive because someone told them to do it, but there's a much better way to do that, and it involves machines. And then those people can spend more time analyzing that language and finding better language and creating better products. So the ROI question, it's tricky, but it requires people to realize the initial process you're doing is being replaced by something totally different that is infinitely more efficient, and that's okay because we're all going to find more important things to do. Yeah.
Yeah, from our perspective, it was, well, what are you going to do with that 750 hours a year? Write more products, create new innovative products that we can bring to market, do a more thorough job of underwriting audits, work more closely with our claim professionals and our underwriters. It's a hard conversation because we all sort of jump to a conclusion that's not accurate, and that's that it's, you know, killing large swaths of jobs. Instead, it actually challenges you to say, well, how can I add as much value to the organization as possible? And so we were really lucky with the RiskGenius implementation to have an amazing executive sponsor who saw that number and immediately said, well, here's how you're gonna add 5 times as much value back to the organization with that cost savings. And oh, by the way, the ROI is gonna be even bigger because we can finally bring X, Y, and Z product to market that we've wanted to, but we haven't been able to. We can finally respond to X, Y, and Z change in the market or shift in the market, and we can support ultimately sort of the goals in North America, in this case, better. But I would say that the conversation, the ROI conversation, is one that has to happen. And if it's not happening, then you're not using AI the right way. You're not thinking about it the right way. You're not tackling big enough problems. Because it's a maturity sort of curve that we're going up against, and we've gotten to the point now where we have 5 or 6 different meaningful AI implementations across the globe within QB that are delivering millions of dollars a year in savings or growth or cost takeout. And that's a conversation now that comes more naturally. It's still tough because you're still asking people who are doing good work, hard work, skilled work, asking them how long certain things are taking and then saying, hey, what if I did that instantly? Or what if I removed you from that process? And they're gonna be defensive. But keeping them as part of the process, keeping them at the core of everything you're doing is a nice way of getting around it, because those exact same people that are saving 750 hours a year, they were right next to Chris throughout the entire process. And they were the ones telling him, well, what else could the tool do? How else could we save more time? Which is really cool. And so we weren't necessarily doing it in secret, we were doing it in collaboration.
Yeah, and the leaders step up during these POCs, and when you're testing AI, by the way, I see it time and again. People that get excited about this technology are your leaders, typically. And it's really amazing to see. I've seen 1 or 2 people kind of bow out of a POC, and that makes me sad for them. But most people like embrace this, and they're like, well, can it also do X, Y, and Z, right? And so then we start building new features for them. So maybe I'm not seeing the people that are scared by AI taking their jobs. Maybe they're not part of the POC. That could be true. But at the same time, there's a lot of people in every organization that get really, really, really excited about this stuff. There's a carrier we're going to see in Des Moines tomorrow who is super excited about this, and so are we. So I'll also tell you on the regulator side, which we were talking about, they're really excited about aspects of AI as well and how AI might be able to be used to help with filings. So there's a lot of opportunities, and I actually think that the employees are excited about this stuff if they get to have a say in how it's going to be used and how it's going to work for them, like any software.
Right, any questions?
I just had one. Product development's of great interest to me, and I was thinking there'd be a possibility you guys could come up with the ideal contract. Let's say an ideal auto PNC product contract where it's structured in a way that's rational to your machine and maybe not as much to humans. I was just going to suggest that maybe you could have an ideal PNC contract that your machine actually derives. So you had the BI, the PD, the endorsements all in a particularly rational structure, and intentional act was defined the same way in every one of those sections. And all the things that you've so brilliantly put together to, or at least identified the problem and a solution for it. Have you considered developing an ideal contract? So we want to have a whole new product development situation. You want to have a new auto contract, a new policy. Could the contract write it, or the AI write it?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. So our machine learning platform is named Johan, and I let our chief scientist, his name is Casey, name it because he helped write the program. And so I said, what is Johan? Because I'm the one explaining this to people. And he said, well, I named it after Johann Gutenberg, who created the first printing press. And I said, why? Okay, why? And he said, well, I think eventually this is going to be writing policies. And he explained it was similar to like how you can take one person's face and another person's face and mash them together. It's similar technology like that. So eventually he thinks these things will update themselves. Imagine a case law comes out and you ingest that case law. The AI interprets the case law, understands it, and then updates all the language based on that case law. That kind of stuff's coming. It's a little ways off, but absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so you're going to owe me for this, but one of the things that I've seen come out of Chris's organization is a really interesting study in comparison of cyber forms across the industry. So I don't know about the perfect auto policy, but I'm pretty sure your CFO and CEO want to have the right one in the market. And so I don't know all the details to describe it, but basically they looked at different forms of cyber and found some gaps in the market.
Yeah, we basically wanted to see, everyone says the cyber forms are all different across carriers because it's a fairly new product. So we took a scoring algorithm to look at the similarities and differences in all the clauses, and we scored them against each other across carrier. And we averaged those scores to figure out, all right, which clauses are most similar, which ones have outliers, and then we did that for CGL as well for the same carriers. And absolutely, the cyber policies are all over the place, whereas CGL, you see common definitions, common exclusions. So, yeah, that's one application. Thanks.
And then we're finding, I think, product development is sort of one of those untouched frontiers at this point within our industry, as far as like an adoption of technology and particularly emerging tech like AI. We're finding sort of niche use cases to not the extreme of crafting the perfect policy, but how do we use AI in things like manuscripting? And so Chris has spent a fair amount of time with our team in the UK, our Lloyd's syndicates, around how could you leverage a tool like this, a platform like this, that's not only ingesting the hundreds of thousands of policies that we have, but also all of the bespoke or manuscript policies. How do we use it both from an audit perspective and a new product development perspective? How can we create those controls that everyone's always wanted and everyone's always tried or said that they have on manuscripting? How do we actually do that for real, where the underwriter still feels like they have the ability to write the policy they need to get the deal, but that they're only using verbiage that's very, sort of strictly approved, and they're only using it sort of in the spacing and the rhythm that it's allowed to be used in. Fascinating use cases, all still powered by AI. No one cares about that. The fact of the matter is it makes them, their jobs easier. It makes their day-to-day more efficient. It allows them to sell much quicker and move on to the next deal. And for us, that's everything. We're only using AI in situations where we can have a demonstrated ROI. And that means that it has to be a very, very finely articulated use case, like a manuscripting, like a product development.
Yeah, the users using our software could care less about AI. They don't care. They show up and they want to be able to do their jobs faster. That's it. So it's a workflow issue for them, and that's totally fine. Once we got that into our heads, that became much more important to get the software right, and we'll have the AI catch up.
And then I think there's a sort of portion of the employee base or user base within an insurance carrier that at least I found is maybe a little bit more defensive of AI, and those are folks in the data and science, data and actuarial areas, so data analytics actuaries, who traditionally have been looked at to build models like these. And really the sales pitch there and the thing that we've been pushing there is the sheer volume of the data that we're able to pump through. So we have a use case in a specialty line that we write out of Southeast Asia, where we have a platform that ingests 250 million data points a day. You can't have a big enough data analytics team to build a model, build the infrastructure to support that. You have to have something that's exponentially more powerful than a team of humans. And those are the scenarios where we can say the AI is doing the heavy lifting. We're bringing in more data than we could have ever dreamed of. And with that data, as it gets structured by the AI, you can now make infinitely better models from it. And so it still goes back to we're having a massive efficiency gain by bringing in more data, easier, cheaper, faster. We're allowing you to do more value-added work, actually building the models and not playing with the data as it comes in and normalizing it and doing all that stuff. And we're more competitive because we're creating better pricing models, better risk selection models, and we're paying claims better. So it's all back to how are we quantifying that lift and how are we actually showing the end user that it's making their lives so much better, because it is and it should. And if it's not, you're not using it right, or you're using it for the wrong problem. And so it spans every role at carrier. And I'm sure you've seen that from a Microsoft perspective, how you're approaching carriers and who you're approaching within carriers.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's really, again, it's the end-to-end. It's capturing risk before you sell a product and how you develop the product, and then throughout the whole life cycle as well. One of my former employers, I mean, they were able to track typhoons going across Asia and estimate claims based on the different projected tracks of the typhoon across Asia and Malaysia or wherever. It's like, okay, if it goes this way, we're going to lose this much money. But this is how much of an impact on the commercial facilities we have covered. Or if it goes that way, it's going to be this way. So it's they can do that in real time. There's no way you could have a team of people with Excel spreadsheets really process that information. It has to be. And no company is really going to build out a system that's constantly changing on-prem either. It's really a cloud-only option. So we have tools to help do that. And that's really why I'm here, to really make sure that if there's some gap in what we're delivering, that people communicate that back. So I'm in the cloud engineering area. We have a whole series of tools that are on the IoT side. We're investing another $5 billion on IoT devices in the next year. And really making sure that all that information flows into the cloud and then can be used by insurers and other companies globally. So I know we had another question over here.
Yeah, I just want to know if there were any examples of products within the United States developed as the result of the application of artificial intelligence to policy form development.
If I knew the answer to that question, I would not be able to tell you because it'd be like proprietary to that carrier. Yeah, so no, not that I know.
Yeah.
Can you expand on how it would impact the regulatory perspective? Maybe address some of the challenges and maybe even some of the benefits of how AI would impact, state insurance divisions, things of that nature?
Sure, yeah. So we've been exploring kind of how AI or machine learning might be able to help with the process of form filings. It's tricky, it's hard, the regs are long, the statutes are long, the bulletins are long, there's lots of filings that are coming in. And so we're looking at the process and I guess I don't want this to sound like a pitch, so I'm trying not to be too pitchy, but basically you have a lot of people reviewing forms and then trying to review regulations and match them up. That's not much different than that copying a clause and putting it into a spreadsheet scenario, right? What we found is when people copy a clause and put it into a spreadsheet and you have 10 of them doing it across 10 months, they're going to do things inconsistently with each other, right? So one person calls this a war exclusion, another person calls this war and terrorism exclusion. And so the same thing starts to develop at the state level with filings. You'll have one person have a statute and a filing, and they will interpret it one way and then rule one way. Someone else may not even notice that statute and then see a filing and then interpret it another way. And so by making the information accessible to the people reviewing those filings or the carriers that need to know those statutes are in place, but they miss it, because it happens both ways, by the way, right? By creating and connecting all that information, you can create more consistency across the filing process. So that's really what I'm interested in doing, is seeing if we can make that process more consistent so that John at this side of the office and Betty over at this side of the office, they have access to the same information, not just the information in their head or in the person next to them. Does that make sense to some degree? Yeah.
The other one that I'd give you is market conduct examinations, which kind of look around and see if there's any faces of pain in the room, but anyone who's familiar with what that's like. I was in the branch management when we had those done, and you lose that conference room for a month, and you lose people off of production from pulling paper policies, and it's no fun for the people coming and living. Anyway, you guys get it. I think that'd be a great, with some of these tools, to be able to maybe one day not only have it be digital, but maybe it's something that is just continuous rather than a point in time. But a place I would start would be, how could we do market conduct exams differently with tools like this?
And so I'll throw the pessimistic one out there, just because we're talking about regulation, and that's the fun thing to do. Something we're really concerned about with AI is interpretability. It's a cause that's near and dear to our heart. At QBE, we're spending a lot of time with a lot of different academics trying to research ways of getting the accuracy that we're continuing to see advance in off-the-shelf products from vendors like Microsoft and IBM and startup products, while also getting an appropriate level of interpretability about why the AI made the decision it made. This is much more of an issue on decisions of consequence, paying claims, pricing risk, underwriting, things of that nature. It's irresponsible today, in my opinion, to leverage a lot of this technology for those types of decisions, because we don't have an easy way or an accurate way of saying why it did what it did. What factors about the risk did it bring in? What else did it look at? Is it legal for it to look at that? Should it be considering that? And one of the reasons why we have humans that have underwriting authority is you can try them if you have to ask, why did you make that decision? And you can put them on the spot, and you cannot do that with AI right now. And if you have an interpretable model, you are giving up something in accuracy. It's just a scientific fact. And so there need to be more and more advances made in that space. It's an area that I think the industry should be leading, because there are very obvious applications of AI in decisions of consequence, particularly on more commoditized lines, personal motor, personal homeowners, renters, travel, SME type stuff. The high volume decisions, we should, like we do today, sort of have models that pass stuff through without touching it or send it to an underwriter to look at. We've got to get the AI to the spot where we're really, really comfortable with the decisions it's making, but also how it's making them, and it's able to tell us that. And that's sort of the holy grail. There's a lot of very, very, very smart people looking into it. I would encourage any of you who have the ability, at either from the carrier side or the intermediary side or the regulatory side, to get involved in that conversation. It's an important one. People need to know that there's real business application for this. It's not just an academic theoretical play. But until we get there, I fear that startups and carriers alike are going to not enjoy their interactions with regulators when they're attempting to leverage AI in certain decisions, and they shouldn't enjoy those interactions until they can actually prove why it's making the decisions it's making.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Ted, because get out in front of this. If you're an AI advocate in your organization, no matter what it is, And all you have to do is look at Zuckerberg in front of Congress. He's got no idea why his system made the decisions that it did. And if you're in a regulated business and you look at a regulator and you say, yeah, I don't know why I did that, we know what happens. They'll shut you down. It's not like, a slap on the wrist and, okay, go on back and keep doing what you're doing. You're out of business. And so it's distinctly different. And the reason that I would say get out in front of it is because if you don't, in insurance, my experience, we have 1,000 ways to say no and only a couple to say yes. And you don't want anybody, you don't want that issue to get out, you don't want to be behind that issue when it's brought up at the executive table and people say, well, how are we actually going to control it? You want to either have a plan or you want to know where the gaps are and you want to be involved in trying to get a solution to it. We will find a solution. It might end up being humans involved, but it's a real issue that until you deal in this space with a background of knowing how you can get challenged and what the doomsday results are and not having the right answer. So the fact we don't have an answer is partly because people haven't looked at it yet. So I'm really glad you brought that up.
Yeah, we've got a internal real-world use case where we worked really closely with a startup outside of the U.S. to come up with an AI-based pricing engine, and we took that and we understood what third-party data it was bringing, and we realized that the vast majority of it we couldn't use to price on. You're talking things like age, sex, race, income levels, where they've lived in the past, and income levels of where they've lived in the past. I mean, it's pretty scary, this sort of correlations that it starts to draw out, but it only makes sense, right? It's trying to get a holistic picture and then figure out what it thinks is sort of a meaningful amount of information to make the decision it needs to make and then price off of it. Theoretically, it makes sense, but that's not how our industry works, and it's not how it should work. So we have a long ways to go, and I hope that we don't run into situations where people attempt to push the technology further than it really should, because it's very, very appealing to do that, but it really shouldn't be done at this point.
So there, in that case, just to keep it to the topic, that would be a negative ROI?
That was a very negative ROI. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. You have a question up front here?
So just kind of curious, we talked an awful lot about using policies and stuff to figure out where the AI is, about policies, pricing, and so on. How about just automation of basic tasks? So for example, I know that Microsoft has a paper out about how the chatbot for Progressive was done through them to save money in the call centers. Any looking at using AI for just driving down costs of common traffic?
So we just invested in a company called Hyperscience out of New York City, and their complete premise is automation of back office work. And I can tell you that from sort of a high level perspective, the initial use case, 2 days of a POC and about 6 weeks of implementation, it was 6 FTE is what we saved just for automating the ingestion of claim documents, claim notes. That was it. And so you think then about everything else you bring in and the ability for an AI-type platform to ingest that. That's only started the problem, because all you get out of that is a ton of data you don't know what to do with. So again, I go back to that vertical AI and how does it then integrate into everything else, and how does it drive that decisioning? I believe that for a company like QBE, the bigger lift for us with AI is internal optimization versus external growth. And that may just be a near-term 5 to 7 year time frame. But if you think about how much money we spend in just general operating expenses and what a lot of that looks like, and then you think about, could you train a platform to do it? Oftentimes the answer is a resounding yes, and it can be done today, and it can be done within the bounds of regulation and sort of the moral code, and it can add a ton of lift from just a cost extraction perspective. And so, yeah, we're seeing that. We're going to be rapidly deploying over the next 9 months in about 32 countries this platform. The results should be just tremendous for us.
And that's a good question, too, on where to look for an ROI on where to apply AI. So I used to be a lawyer, litigator, right? And so I'd review lots and lots of documents when I first started practicing. And then I noticed that that started going away, those documents, and I was doing other stuff. And those documents I read were getting sent to India and China to be reviewed. And then a few years after that, this technology came out called technology-assisted review, so it's machine learning. And so that type of technology started reading the documents. And so the work that had been outsourced to India and China started to go away, right? And so I've always kind of kept that in the back of my head. And if you look at the insurance industry, it's kind of on the tail end of this outsourcing process to India and China. And I would argue all those tasks that were outsourced are sitting ducks for AI. And that's right where I would look for where to apply this stuff. It's exactly why we are working on this new product that's going to do policy checking in an automated way. Because right now, all that's being outsourced to India and China, or a lot of it. So yeah, those repetitive tasks. And the other thing to think about is 1,000 people, thousands of people have been trained up on those tasks. So it's a repetitive task that people have learned how to train on. And so that is the data then, and that is the training that you give the machine to then learn how to do the same thing.
So those companies who have gone through the process of, sort of taking advantage of a labor arbitrage situation by moving work to other geographies, which is not saying the word that I'm trying not to say, they're the ones that are set up to take full advantage of this really quickly. They're the ones that already have all these processes outlined. They've got best practices. They've gone through optimization efforts. They've got teams in place that can train the models, that can validate the models. Oftentimes they have contractual situations where they have that headcount that can help out. That's what we're seeing. We have a team of 3,500 QB employees in the Philippines, and we're going to be spending a lot of time there with this technology because A, it can make their life easier, it can make their life better, they can do more work, which is sort of the near-term goal, and then the long-term goal, you've got a very nice opportunity to take out some of those costs and to improve accuracy and sort of response times on some of that.
So on the front end, do you have AI as well?
So from like a chatbot perspective and things like that, we don't. I'll go back to the ROI. I really think that our efforts right now are best placed in more back office type tasks and in tasks like product development and things of that nature. I've found it relatively challenging to quantify a meaningful ROI on some of that. And also, to be honest, it just depends on who your customers are. We're not Progressive, we're not Geico, we're not State Farm. We're big, gross commercial specialty risks. They don't want to talk to us with a chatbot. Our intermediaries don't want to talk to us with a chatbot. It's sexy. It'll look good in a press release, but how do I drive that ROI? How do I get tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in cost outtake? It's back office work. It's processing tasks. It's getting access to data that we've never had before, such as in our UK business, we made all of our commercial auto risks do a quarterly survey. Basically, it just, how many trucks do you have? How many miles are on them? How many drivers do you have? Why we did it, no one knows. What we did with the data was put it in a filing cabinet, never look at it. And we're now realizing that we can use hyperscience to ingest all that data and actually make sense of it. That's a massive lift. That's a completely different way than interacting with a customer on the front end, which if our business needed it, we could probably quantify an ROI, but that's a huge lift. That's a real lift that our customers will never know about. And so from our perspective, we're not really touching the front end all that much right now. Maybe if we get into more commoditized lines, we would feel the need to, but I don't think it's the best application for us, and it's really a business-to-business decision.
Yeah, so two things on that. So commodity, consumer lines, you do see a big lift. We have interviewed insurers who are further along with the whole chatbot, intelligent chatbots, and they're saying that 80% of some of their call center traffic around the most common questions are now being handled first level. So that can be a huge a significant improvement. So I think it does definitely matter. The one piece, though, that's not in terms of the front end that I'd encourage everybody who's involved in intermediated business, so if you have an agent there, to consider that we're not seeing, that we think is a really great area of opportunity, is actually assisting the CSR in an agency with some of this technology. So we always talk about the consumer's gonna come in, you know, how much is my next bill, and you get that automated. But we don't hear very often them saying, let's apply this to a CSR that doesn't understand, you know, well, why do I have to know about roof types? I mean, there are CSRs out there that have never done manual rating. They don't know what the construction codes are for or even how they're used. And we really actually see the ability to use some of these tools on the front end and to be able to get a lift from that, but not from the consumer standpoint, but from the intermediated helping that CSR.
Yeah, I know we have some examples, you know, on our Microsoft website of how people are using drones to periodically double check property. You know, if you're in a fire, like a brush fire area, you mow down all the brush around your property, maybe inspect things in real time. We've got examples of where they're doing predictive maintenance on like power lines. So they get a drone that flies and checks all the insulators on the line end to end, which if they had set a crew out there to do that, you know, it would take a long time, then maybe miss some, so you can replay it backwards and forwards and it automatically checks that. So it's both on really quantifying risk and then risk mitigation. You know, to one of the comments we had earlier, as you're ingesting data and knowing more about your clients and about their risk, you know, one of the things that could be a reverse ROI is if you know something and do nothing. So that's another set of liabilities that we might want to look at too, especially from an AI perspective. So if you're tracking someone's heart rate monitor and it spiked to 300 beats a minute, you know, they're probably going to have an issue, and you knew about it and did nothing. So some of that, a lot of the insurers now are capturing that information through a third party and only getting flags after an event. So there's no real-time interaction with those devices. But it's, again, another risk that you could have if you don't interact with, you know, do some mitigation to prevent that, and you could have, then maybe you have some additional liability.
So I know we're coming up on the end here. Any final question from anyone? No? All right. Oh, yeah. Yeah. He gets a prize.
Accepting all the caveats the danger of using AI to interpret policies and so on, does RiskGenius currently risk score for regulatory compliance? And if so, has it been submitted to the regulators and shown how you did it? And I mean, it seems to me you don't have to get into the math necessarily to say that you always include this particular regulation and whatever.
Yeah, so I think I could say we're doing a couple pilots with states, including Iowa, to figure out how to make this work for the regulatory process. So it could be something as simple as, you know, if you open up a form and you're looking at the war exclusion, our software automatically pulls up that war exclusion regulation, and then you can see them side by side, to showing you clauses that have already been approved next to the one that you're looking at, or getting eventually to the point where, you know, if something has been approved yesterday and it's the same language, and, you know, maybe that doesn't even have to be reviewed at that point. So there's different iterations that we're working through. Yeah, there's definitely some discussions going on about how this could work for the regulatory side of things as well. Yep.
Well, thanks a lot, guys.
Yeah, thanks,
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.